threw up some rather interesting results, I thought. 4 in 10 Australians, importantly those who don't consider themselves born again, still somehow believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Was that surprising to you?
The whole thing was surprising to us. I mean, we commissioned this survey just before our Life of Jesus documentary was being screened on Channel 7 and put out as a DVD. And the results were almost the opposite of what I'd expected anyway. I thought we'd find out that most Aussies didn't know much about Jesus anymore and actually really didn't have very strong beliefs about him at all. But we found out that 42% of Aussies who don't call themselves born-agains think Jesus was a real person, but also that he had divine powers. And 45.2% of those non-born-again Aussies actually think Jesus rose from the dead. We don't know exactly what that means, but that's a very high percentage.
That's very surprising. There are a few other things. 11% of non-born-agains said that they didn't think Jesus was a person, but I imagined that to be higher. Were you the same?
Yeah, I thought it would be higher because that's the kind of message you're hearing from the atheist writers at the moment, from any kind of mainstream documentary you see screened on the ABC. There was one over Easter that was making strange claims about Jesus. I mean, there's a real mood of scepticism out there in the media about him. Even the idea that perhaps he didn't exist, perhaps he's a mythical figure made up by the church, the leaders in the early centuries to try and shape a new movement. But with 11% is still, I guess, higher than we'd like, given that we feel like having the view that Jesus didn't exist is kind of like thinking the world's flat. It's there's just so much kind of strong data out there for thinking Jesus really was a historical figure. But it's lower than we expected.
What do you make of it, though? Do you think the scepticism that we see in some of the prominent writers or in the media is not representative of the general mood of the community?
Yeah, and that's what the stats are telling us, that most people still have a very positive view of Jesus and a view that the story of Jesus, the account of Jesus that we find in the Gospels is pretty reliable. We did find that lots of people still don't know where to go to look for the story of Jesus. Bizarrely, about 31% of Australians think that Jesus lived BC.
Before himself.
Before he was born, yeah. Which I think says, there's just a bit of confusion about, the dating system and where we got BC and AD from. That's very high, so I think there's still a lot of work to be done to help people find out about Jesus.
Is it a kind of a vague sense of Jesus as an important person? He's done some interesting things, had an influence on the culture, but not much really in terms of understanding who he is or what relevance he might have.
Yeah, maybe, although the survey did say that people still know the sayings of Jesus. Most Australians could identify whether a saying came from Jesus or not from Jesus. Very high figures, 80-90% of people getting that right. A quarter of Australians thought that Jesus taught that God helps those who help themselves. He didn't. It was Benjamin Franklin. But by and large, people actually know that Jesus said things like, I've come that you may have life, or do unto others as you have done unto yourself. So there's still, I guess, what you'd call a kind of resonance out there for Jesus' teaching. Mm-hmm. And he's associated with positive things. Jesus is associated with life, with caring, with love. I think that's a great thing.
The documentary that you mentioned that was aired on Channel 7 in Australia on Good Friday and is getting a bit of attention around the place. It's trying to address some of the confusion around Jesus. What's the driving sort of idea behind the documentary?
We wanted to put out a doco which anyone could watch and say, yeah, this is solid. A historical documentary that took you through Jesus' life from Bethlehem, where he was born, through the events of his death and resurrection. And you could watch it and see that what mainstream historians agree upon happened in Jesus' life. So it's written and filmed in order to appeal to the widest possible audience. What you can do then with the life of Jesus is look behind it and say, well, if Jesus did live and he did do these things, he did teach these things, well, what significance does that have? And it brings up all sorts of questions for people, questions like, does God exist, or can we believe in miracles these days? And we addressed those on the DVD in a whole series of conversations that John Dixon and I had about these big issues, by going behind the life of Jesus.
So there's two elements to it. There's a historical narrative of the life, and then the so what question.
Yeah, the big personal philosophical questions that you might want to dig into if you took the story of Jesus seriously. I mean, that's the interesting thing from this survey. 45.2% of non-Christian Australians think Jesus rose from the dead. I wonder what they make of Jesus then. Do they think he's still alive today? In what sense did he rise from the dead? Does he have any call upon your life as a result of that? Now, there's some really tough questions to deal with there. And if people already think it probably happened, we want to help them work out, well, what does it mean that it happened?
Yeah, that was a stunning finding, that particular one. I don't know if you want to perhaps place too much on it. I don't know how people fill these sorts of things in, but it does echo something that is a surprise, isn't it? I noticed that the person writing the TV guide perhaps didn't share that idea. They wrote that this was a fictional story of Jesus. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well,
an editorial comment, or is it a typo?
I wouldn't be brave enough to say it was an editorial comment, but it was strange to see that in the guide section of the Sydney Morning Herald that the Life of Jesus documentary was described as a fictional account of Jesus. It was produced to tell the exact opposite story, that you can really rely on the story of Jesus you get from the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and from other historical sources. But, I mean, maybe it says something about the vibe out there in the kind of more sceptical part of Australian culture, that they think it's fiction. And that's the kind of default position people take. But I think that's probably the more sceptical end of things, because our data actually says that when you interview a whole representative sample of Australians, nearly half of Australians think that Jesus actually was real and was special, somehow divine, and that he rose from the grave.
It brings up another interesting thing about this Easter that's just passed. We hear reported in the press that Easter services had an unusually large attendance. Easter's a time when people who go twice a year to church do go, so I guess numbers swell a little bit at Easter time. But they're telling us it was really pumping in the churches over the weekend. There's a few things going on. I suppose the financial crisis is one that people are suggesting is one of the reasons, with people starting to feel less secure in their financial status, starting to question things and so on. What did you make of the supposed larger attendances at church?
Yeah, I didn't know whether people went to church at Easter time still. I knew they turned up at Christmas. I knew you had Christmas carol service and people would happily go along to Christian events at that time of year, but I wasn't sure about Easter. So this has really enlightened me that actually people will come along. And they do know that Easter is about Jesus' death and resurrection. That was one of the questions in our survey. I think it was 57% of Aussies knew that Easter was about the death of Jesus, and 87% knew it was about the resurrection. I assume they all knew it was about the death as well. And that means it still surprised me, though, that they were happy to come to church. So I think probably the churches ought to take that seriously, that there's a kind of general sense of interest out there in recovering Christianity for people who've left it behind, or maybe inquiring for the first time for those who haven't been to church.
It's less a case now that it's just a traditional thing to do, or a family thing to do that your parents did. I think, modern generations have sort of thrown out a lot of the other things, so it may well say something about the mood in the community.
You might be right, because you're not forced to go to church as much anymore. You don't feel like you've got to turn up because that's the right thing to do by society. You're going under your own steam, and it may mean that people are actually looking around a bit for a basis in their lives, saying, okay, we tried out a few things, we left God behind for a while. We've been building our little material nest that's got a bit of a hammering over the last year or so. My super's gone downhill, but what's holding my life together? Where am I going to look? I know, I'll go to church. I remember something about church being important.
It's interesting too that some have suggested things like the devastating bushfires in Victoria that have recently left a real mark in Australia. May have also contributed to a mood where people are thinking of things beyond the material and into spiritual questions.
I think you might be right, Simon. I think big events like that, the tsunami a while ago, September 11, those sort of big events remind us of our mortality, remind us that life is short, and we start to focus on the serious things. I guess we can very easily get distracted, though, and that's my concern, I guess, at this point now after Easter, when there's been the little flurry of interest in the media and you've seen a documentary, maybe you turned up to a service, then you just forget about it. You go back to working and looking after your family and doing all those important things, but you actually forget about the really serious ongoing matter of you and God. So I hope that people continue to explore their interest in Jesus that's been